Hey everybody, this is Tim and welcome to the show. So tonight we're going to answer the age-old question, what came first, the chicken or the egg? And one of my favorite groups is the Alice Cooper group, and between 1970 and 1975 they had a long string of hits before lead singer Vince Fournier decided to go solo. He actually changed his name legally to Alice Cooper to do so. So the question remains, what came first, the chicken or the egg? What came first, Alice Cooper or the Alice Cooper group? And in the case of Alice Cooper, it was definitely the chicken. So this is a famous Sunset Strip, and it's been a mecca for bands since the 60s, and it still is for that matter, and it was no different for the Alice Cooper group. They formed in 1964 as a joke for a high school talent show in Phoenix, Arizona. And with a nod to the Beatles, the Earwigs, as they were called, consisted of Vince Fournier on vocals, his best friend and fellow art student Dennis Dunaway on bass, Glen Buxton on guitar, and original drummer John Spear and guitarist John Tatum. After graduating high school, they replaced Tatum with guitarist and budding songwriter Michael Bruce, and started performing the Arizona bar circuit as the Spiders. They put out a record and enjoyed some modest local success. They even opened for the Yardbirds, but it soon became clear to them that they were the big fish in the small pond, and if they wanted anything real to happen, they'd have to come here to Los Angeles to do it. So in 1967, the band took their first trip here to the Sunset Strip, and they witnessed firsthand the hundreds of bands and thousands of other musicians just like them. And that's when they fully realized that if you wanted to hold an audience's attention, artiness and theatrics would have to become part of the show. But luckily, Vince and Dennis Dunaway were very arty guys. So for months, the band, who now went by the name The Naz, split their time between LA here and Phoenix, for Mom's home cooking, obviously. And as a matter of fact, once when they were making one of the all-night trips back to LA from Phoenix, their van wrecked on the interstate. It flipped over 3 times and destroyed all their gear, but miraculously didn't seriously hurt anybody. So eventually they were able to rent a house on the Santa Monica, California street that was big enough for them to rehearse and crash at, and with an owner that was either cool enough to rent to them or stupid enough to rent to them. But anyways, it was right here. It was about at this time that they ran into drummer Neal Smith, who was an old friend from Phoenix, and he'd been out here in California playing with a band that had just recently broken up. And one thing led to another, and John Spear was out and Neal Smith was in. But I think this was one of the benchmarks for the band, because Neal played unlike any other drummer in a band at the time. He rarely played a straight beat. You know, the rhythm section of Neal Smith and the equally as unique bass playing of Dennis Dunaway was always looking for something different. And I can't think of a single instance of them playing a song straight up rock and roll all the way through. Anyways, rehearsal, living space, Beethoven. So it wasn't long before the band was informed of another group in Philadelphia featuring an innovative young guitarist named Todd Rundgren, who had put out a record as The Naz. Now, the urban legend is that the name Alice Cooper came from a session with a Ouija board, and true or not, it would prove a blessing and a curse to the band. The blessing being that naming an all-male, androgynous-looking group after a female was great promotion. The curse being that the charismatic lead singer would slowly and quite naturally morph into the Alice character and completely unbalance the structure of the band, which at the time was all for one and one for all. So this bit of Venice boardwalk here used to be the site of a place called Lick Pier and Pacific Ocean Park, which was an amusement park. And the Cheetah Club was a dilapidated but huge rock club in the 60s, which had formerly been the Aragon Ballroom, and its host and MC was none other than our favorite accordion playing TV star, Lawrence Welk. But in 1967 and 68, bands like The Doors, Buffalo Springfield, Love, and a very strange and somewhat glittery crew who had recently changed their name from the Naz to Alice Cooper and became the house band here, played at the Cheetah, which once stood right here. And after the shows, the party would often get brought back to Beethoven Street, and that's where they met and bonded with Syd Barrett and Pink Floyd, who stayed with them for an extended stay, and they bonded over their love of avant-garde music and light shows. But the Cheetah was also where the band first played for managers Shep Gordon and Joe Greenberg, who would prove invaluable at guiding their future careers. The clincher for Shep Gordon was that he had never witnessed the band clearing a crowd out with their onstage antics faster than Alice Cooper had done that night, and he was sold. Anyways, the Cheetah Club closed for good in 1969, and it actually burnt to the ground in 1970, and the senior housing is now here, and I think it's one of life's delicious ironies that the people that used to go to the Cheetah Club are probably now living here. Now we're driving up Laurel Canyon, and in 1968 the band was hanging out with a group of young ladies called Girls Together Outrageously, or the GTOs, and they would play a major part in the history of Alice Cooper. Among them were Miss Pamela DeBar, then there was Miss Mercy, and most importantly Miss Christine, who would play a very crucial role in not only shaping Vince's image to the Alice persona, but also in being the main force behind introducing them to Frank Zappa. And it didn't hurt that he had recently started a record company called Straight Records and was looking for talent. Anyways, here's our destination, the log cabin. So in case you've been living on Mars, Laurel Canyon is a place where the who's who of the late 60s music scene went to party, and the Alice Cooper group was no exception. So Jim Morrison and Glen Buxton were drinking buddies, but Morrison was friends with everyone in the band, and it's rumored that the Doors song Roadhouse Blues, the line, "Woke up this morning and got myself a beer," was actually something that Vince had said to Jim Morrison one morning. But Laurel Canyon's most famous resident, Frank Zappa, occupied this long abandoned space right here, and it was known as the Log Cabin. The log cabin burned down on a Halloween night decades ago, but one of the true legends of Alice Cooperism occurred right here one morning. The oft-told story of how Alice Cooper came to be signed by Zappa's Straight Records label was that GTO Miss Christine had arranged a 6:30 audition for the boys, and in their exuberance they arrived at 6:30 a.m. and started playing their excruciatingly loud set. So a half-sleeping and very perturbed Frank Zappa said, "I don't get it," and he signed them precisely because he didn't get it, and that's how Pretties for You, their first record, began. It came out in 1969. It was very psychedelic and very free-flowing. They recorded it quickly, and it was obvious that there was no thought whatsoever into it being a commercial record. That being said, there was a couple of gems on it, and there's a lot of room in the material for theatrics, and as we all know, theatrics would become Alice Cooper's calling card. Right here, the log cabin. The band began renting this now very gentrified Hollywood Hills home, and we're about to sign contracts with managers Shep Gordon and Joe Greenberg. But since only Michael and Dennis were over 21, the rest of the band had to have their parents flown in to co-sign with them, and it took more than a little persuasion to get the Ferniers and the Buxtons to give up on their sons' college educations and agree. I think it's important to note that Vietnam was raging at this time, and every able-bodied young American male had to register for the draft. And despite the long hair, glitter, and glam, the Alice Cooper band was no exception. But for one reason or another, they were all classified as 4F, except for Neal Smith. But as they say, something strange happened on the way to the Forum. The night before he was to report to the induction center, he and Vince and several other people decided to drive out to the desert, get drunk, and target practice with a .22 rifle. And long story short, Vince accidentally shot Neal in the foot, and that was that as far as the U.S. Army was concerned. But with Uncle Sam in the rearview mirror, they felt that nothing could stop them at this point. Right here.
After making another rushed and somewhat avant-garde album for Zappa and Straight Records called Easy Action, the Alice Cooper contract was taken over by Warner Brothers Records, and it was do or die time. Their managers Shep Gordon and Joe Greenberg had by now moved to New York City, and the band found themselves more often than not playing in the Midwest. Places like Cincinnati, Toledo, and right here in the heart of the Rust Belt, not to mention Vince's childhood hometown, Detroit, Michigan. One of the more notable places they regularly played here was the now-defunct Grande Ballroom, where they shared bills with the MC5 and became running mates with Detroit's punk rock forebears, the Stooges, who were led by Iggy Pop, or Iggy Stooge as he was known back then. They often opened for English bands like The Who and other Detroit stalwarts like the Amboy Dukes with Ted Nugent, Grand Funk, Bob Seger, and an all-female band called Cradle, whose emerging star was none other than a teenage Susie Quattro. But the Grande Ballroom was one of the main places that Alice Cooper honed their music and stage show at, to what would soon explode onto not just the American rock scene, but the entire world.
So to be practical, the band ended up moving from LA to Detroit here because it was geographically closer to the gigs that they were playing here in the Midwest. But esoterically, I think their brand of rock and roll, as odd as it was totally accepted by the people in Detroit. And this was the one place in America where I think the band actually belonged. And I think their time here was the happiest and most contented the band was in their history. Anyways, we're right near our next location here. So where I'm standing now is about 30 miles north of Detroit on the outskirts of Pontiac. It's now called Auburn Hills, Michigan, and this all used to be rural farmland. As a matter of fact, right across the street right here was the Michigan State Penitentiary for the criminally insane. But right here where this robotics factory stands now was the Alice Cooper Band House, and it was known to one and all as the Freak Farm, but it consisted of a front house where the entire band lived and partied, and out back there was a horse paddock, and that's where the band would rehearse. And the great thing about living here and being so rural is they could play as late and loud as they wanted to, and it didn't bother anybody. Sometimes they would get a reaction from the insane asylum across the street. They would clap or hoot or holler if they liked something, and the band knew they had something good when that would happen. But this is where they first started working with producer Bob Ezrin on their first masterpiece, Love It to Death. And even though Bob Ezrin was like a year younger than these guys, he was somewhat of a wonder kid when it came to producing, and he really helped them arrange the songs, and he helped them put Vince Furnier's vocals front and center, something they had never done before in their recordings. There were songs like The Ballad of Dwight Fry and Is It My Body, but then there was a song Bob Ezrin first thought was called I'm Edgy, which of course turned out to be their first big hit single, I'm 18. And it was the very definition of a rebellious teenage anthem. Anyways, right here, the Alice Cooper Band House. Eastown, or what used to be the Eastown.
Here on Detroit's east side is what used to be the venue Alice Cooper would play more than anywhere else, the Eastown Theater. When I'm 18 was released, it was the first time the band had actually heard themselves on the radio, and it was being played on CKLW, a huge AM station located across the river in Windsor, Canada. As an example of how hardcore the Detroit rock fans were, the band got them to call the CKLW request line, and 18 became the most requested song in the history of the station. Now, the Eastown is where the Alice Cooper theatrical show finally became fully realized, with props like the electric chair, the gallows, and their beloved band mascot, a boa constrictor named Kachina. It's also rumored that Vince put the finishing touches on becoming Alice right here when he garbage picked his signature top hat in a trash bin in the alley behind the theater. Anyway, the band ended up living in Detroit for 3 years during the time albums Love It to Death and Killer were conceived and recorded. But in 1972, they had moved to Connecticut where they recorded Schools Out, and they never looked back.
So now we're back in LA, and after the overwhelming success of Love It to Death, and particularly the hit single I'm 18, Warner Brothers Records decided to have a coming out party for the Alice Cooper group. And they chose the famous or infamous Ambassador Hotel, where just a couple years previous, in '68, Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated at. It's now a high school, by the way. And for some unknown reason, they decided to call the event Bastille Day. I think it was Bastille Day in France. It was a glorified formal debutante ball and included a sold-out crowd of the who's who of curious Hollywood D-listers like Rod McEwen and Richard Chamberlain. The evening's entertainment was provided by the Cockettes, who were a drag-clad group of gentlemen that served cigarettes and dildos on a silver tray, along with a very yummy party dip made of Vaseline. Also, of course, was the aforementioned GTOs, whose Miss Mercy emerged from a giant cake and proceeded to throw icing all over the tuxedo-clad partygoers. And last but certainly not least was a popular character of the times named TV Mama, a topless 350-pound singer who regaled the partygoers with some down and dirty blues. But the wave of publicity that followed the band's party here pushed Love It to Death back up the charts, and it paved the way for their following album, Killer, to go all the way to number 2, but mission accomplished. So for my money, the guitar riff that kicks off Schools Out is among one of the top 10 of all time, and my guess is that students all over the world to this day play it on the last day of school. The song became a worldwide hit, and I think it put the final strokes of the complete transformation of Vince Fournier into Alice Cooper. And I don't even know if his band was referring to him as Vince after this point. And I think it was a textbook case of the double-edged sword. The band with Alice Cooper as frontman was never more popular, but the rest of the group was starting to be swallowed up by the Alice persona. By the time Billion Dollar Babies was released in 1973, the band were bona fide hitmakers. They had songs like, Elected and No More Mr. Nice Guy. But the rigors of being in a superstar touring rock and roll band were starting to take their toll. And it was coming at them with a vengeance. So the band, and particularly Alice and Glen Buxton's drug of choice, was mainly alcohol. And there's barely a photograph of the band at the time where Alice isn't cradling a Budweiser. In Glen's case, it had gotten so bad that he was missing gigs, and the band had taken measures of hiring an old Phoenix friend, a guitar player named Mick Mashburn, to come on the road and play his parts. Which brings us here to the heart of Hollywood and the crossroads of the world. I believe it's closed now, but this is where they did the famous photograph for the album Muscle of Love. And by the way, that right there is Sunset Sound, where they actually recorded the record. But anyways, we're going to run around back right now and check it out. The graphics company was called Pacific Eye and Ear, and they decided to dress the band up as sailors on leave and photograph them here at the Institute of Nude Wrestling. And the graphics were so realistic that the neighbors were freaking that this place was really moving in. But the sailor concept wasn't the band's idea, and I think it served to personify what was happening to them. They were losing their creative control, and the writing was on the wall, and Muscle of Love would prove to be the last album featuring the original members. I think there were a myriad of reasons that broke up the band, ego, jealousy, money. But I think it came down really to one point, and that's that they were unable to fire Glen Buxton. They loved him too much, and I think it's what eventually tore up the band. So after Muscle of Love, the band took a hiatus to do some solo records. And of course, Alice had a huge hit with Welcome to My Nightmare. But I just don't know if they wouldn't have gotten back together in one form or another if they still had that all for one and one for all camaraderie that they had when Glen was functioning. You know, I guess we'll never know, but when the Alice Cooper contract was renegotiated, the only one at the other end of the table was Vince Furnier. In 2003, Alice Cooper received the star on the Hollywood Boulevard Walk of Fame, but the band was nowhere to be found. The ceremony was 100% about the former Vince Furnier. You know, I think in many ways Alice had earned it. He did all the interviews. He was the face of the group. He clawed his way up the Hollywood Insider ladder, hanging around with the likes of Groucho Marx and putting on his Alice Cooper Pro-Am golf tournament every year and rubbing shoulders. So in 2011, after 14 years of eligibility, the original Alice Cooper band was finally elected into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and were inducted as a group with many accolades for what seemed like everybody's favorite member of the group, Glen Buxton, who had passed away in 1997. Anyways, I'd like to thank everyone in the Alice Cooper band for such a terrific story and for being the soundtrack of my Detroit youth. And it's at this point in the show where I'd like to shamelessly ask your subscription and to like the channel if you haven't already done it. And we've got a terrific back catalog. If you like classic rock, I'm sure you'll dig it. Anyways, for Tim, I want to thank you again. Be kind to one another. Peace out.